Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this conversation on complex trauma and lived experience engagement. My name is Corinne Baker, and I work with the Office of the New South Wales Anti-slavery Commissioner. This is the first in a series of conversations that our office will be hosting as part of an initiative called From the Desk of Lived Experience. As part of my work with the office, I have the real privilege and joy to work with our team's lived experience practice lead, Sarah, as she leads the way in the first full-time lived experience expert role employed in the Australian anti-slavery sector. Sarah and our whole team are learning every day what it means to meaningfully integrate lived experience and expertise into our anti-slavery responses. And From the Desk of Lived Experience stemmed from a desire for Sarah to be able to share her reflections beyond our office with fellow survivors, with allies, and with the broader anti-slavery movement. So each month, Sarah is sharing some of those reflections through a series of written pieces on her Medium page. And she'll also be delving into several key topics in conversation with subject matter experts. Starting today, I'm happy to say, with this conversation with Dr. Sophie Reid on understanding complex trauma. We will have some time for questions for Sarah and Dr. Reid after their conversation. So if you do want to ask something, please click on the Q&A button on your menu bar at the top. You can ask your question at any time, anonymously or with your name. The questions won't be visible to the audience, and we'll do our best to get to as many as possible during the Q&A session. I'd like to start by acknowledging that I'm joining you today from the unceded land of the Darug people and pay my respects to elders past and present, and extend that respect to any Aboriginal people joining the webinar today. Last year, I had the privilege of travelling with the Commissioner and with Sarah and some other members of our team to Dunghutti country, to the site of the former Kinchela Aboriginal Boys Training Home. There we met with some of the uncles who told us about the abuses they endured at that place as boys, stolen from their families. Some of those abuses that would today be called modern slavery. In those and subsequent conversations we've had with the uncles and the team at the Kinchela Boys Home Aboriginal Corporation, they emphasised the intergenerational impact that the trauma they experienced has had on their families and on their communities. So as we embark today on this conversation about the impact of complex trauma, it's important to acknowledge the history of slavery-like practices in New South Wales and their very real and ongoing impact on First Nations communities. I'd also like to acknowledge anyone joining us today who has lived experience of modern slavery or exploitation. Thank you for coming. Thank you for sharing your time with us. We recognise that the nature of the content we'll be discussing today may be challenging for many people. Every one of us has likely had some kind of experience of trauma in our lives, whether directly or as a witness or vicariously. We'd like to draw your attention to the Brave Space guidelines that were shared in the pre-event email. We'll also put the link in the chat now. So you can see those. The conversation in the Q&A session today will be guided by the principles in those guidelines. And although you can see that the microphones and chat function is turned off for today for participants, we hope these guidelines can also be useful as you think through how to create safe environments for engaging with people with lived experience in your own work. And given the content we'll be discussing, please feel free to step out at any point or mute the conversation if you need to take a breath. As we noted in the email, we are recording this webinar and we'll be uploading it to our YouTube channel afterwards as part of our commitment to share this learning around lived experience engagement. So you will be able to catch up on anything you miss by watching the recording in your own time if you would like to do that. There's also free confidential phone counselling available this evening through a service called Converge. So between 5 and 6 o'clock this evening, Australian Daylight Savings Time, Eastern Daylight Savings Time, you can call the number on the screen and quote that case ID number. We will put the details in the announcements, but you may like to also take a photo or a screenshot of these details in case you would like to use that service later on. Okay, I'm now very excited to introduce our two speakers, Sarah S. and Dr. Sophie Reid. Sarah and Sophie, if you'd like to come on camera. There you are. So Sarah is a lived experience practice lead at the Office of the New South Wales Anti-slavery Commissioner. A nurse by background, Sarah is a survivor of modern slavery and a passionate advocate for the integration of lived expertise into anti-slavery responses. In her private capacity, Sarah is co-founder of Survivor Connections, a peer-led support group for people who have experienced modern slavery. Independently, she's also a member of the federal government Survivor Advisory Council, as well as Survivor Alliance's Policy Advocacy Working Group. In fact, Sarah just got off the plane last night from Survivor Alliance's World Congress in Kenya, where she presented to survivors and allies from all around the world about her work integrating lived experience into a mainstream workplace. Dr. Sophie Reid is a clinical psychologist and researcher with over 20 years' experience. She holds a PhD in child and adolescent psychology and a master's in clinical psychology. Passionate about child advocacy, she focuses on healing childhood trauma and supporting parents to interrupt intergenerational impact and transmission. Together with Jace Cannon-Brooks, she established Birchtree Centre, a safe space for survivors of trauma to heal, connect and grow, along with Birchtree Foundation, which helps ensure equity of access to clinical care, particularly in regional Australia. They're now establishing, because they don't have enough to do, Birchtree Hospital Canberra, a world first truly trauma-informed hospital and retreat. Welcome, Sarah. Welcome, Sophie. And I'll hand it over to you for this exciting conversation.
Thanks so much, Corinne.
Thanks, Corinne. Thank you very much to everyone for joining us today. As Corinne's highlighted, joining from the Office of the Anti-Slavery Commissioner today, and I am in Gadigal country today. Sophie, where are you joining us from?
I'm also in Gadigal country as well. So yeah, really excited to be here today, and so honoured to be invited, Sarah. It's really, yeah, really great to be supporting the amazing work you do personally and also what the office does.
It's so exciting to have you on board for this conversation. I think when we first started talking about this topic, you and I could have just talked for weeks and weeks. So we're very aware that we've got some time constraints today. So I'm hoping that we'll cover quite a few of the things that we'd hoped to cover today. But I think we both wanted to sort of say to everyone joining today that this will be a starting conversation rather than an exhaustive discussion. We won't be able to cover everything on this really complicated and important topic. So it's more of a starting point for a conversation. Did you want to add to that, Sophie?
I know, it's reflecting on that. Thank you. Yeah, I think that expecting that we won't be able to close things out. So often we talk about like expecting non-closure, that we'll start conversations, but we are two people in this great big space of doing this work together. And so there will be non-closure around particular, topics or things that we say as well. And that can leave us feeling a bit sort of, jangled, but the other thing also, and I know Corinne said this as well, but just also how important it is for anybody listening to really take care of themselves. For you and I, this is our everyday, but it's not everybody else's everyday, and these are tough conversations.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I think one of the big things that where we wanted to start with this conversation is that I think there's a growing recognition across various sectors, whether it's the modern slavery sector, the domestic and family violence sector, other sectors as well, that engaging with people with lived experience and learning from lived expertise is so crucial in the work that we're doing. But I think in some sectors, they're already a little bit ahead of the modern slavery sector in that regard, in that people are already engaging with lived experience or have more integrated structures to share lived expertise. But in the modern slavery sector in particular, it's a fairly new concept and a fairly new practice. So I think when I started, I encountered quite a lot of fear around, people sort of telling me things like, I really don't want to get it wrong. I don't want to cause harm to survivors that might be coming into the space to do work. And so that was really one of the reasons that I wanted to start this conversation. But I think one of the things that you've highlighted to me as well previously is that there's concept of, I guess, lived experience. We all carry different types of lived experience. And while complex trauma might be a part of that narrative for some of us in a different way, for example, with an experience of modern slavery or trafficking, we've all been touched by trauma in different ways in our lives. And as Corinne said, as we have this conversation, please feel free at any point to step in or out, and to also seek support if you need at a later time. But yeah, I think that concept of trauma as a universal experience, Sophie, did you want to speak to that a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, I think as a clinical psychologist, I was kind of raised, if you like, in the medical model of, the healers and the afflicted and the sort of the disorder model and that sort of model. But what we're seeing, and thank God, thank, whomever got it, what we're seeing is this real change and movement away from seeing people as having a problem and actually understanding where people are coming from and the experiences that have shaped them to be the person they are today. And that in there is no disorder, but in fact, a range of experiences. Most often, what I say when I work with people with complex trauma and sort of and we'll get into what is complex trauma, I know later, but, with experiences of trauma, it's all of the ways in which we manage and we react to that experience are normal, as in like well within the realms of expected and most often designed towards ingenious survival of that experience. And actually the trauma itself is the abhorrent thing, not the person, not what's inside them, any of those sorts of things. And I think that a lot of us who work in this space are here because of our own personal experiences as well. But we don't need to foreground that when we're doing this work. It's more around the work that we do with others. But it's I can see the field moving towards actually being a bit open, that everybody is on this journey together, and that creates less of this pathologizing or really calling somebody disordered and leads towards helping people really understand themselves as actually, I like ingenious survivors. That's a beautiful term made by Janina Fisher, who I really recommend that you read if you're interested in this space.
Absolutely. And I think that's if, when we were talking about what we'd like people to kind of go away with, it's at least a sense of a little bit more comfort in talking about these things, and recognizing that it's kind of something that we all hold space for each other on, and that, like you said, it doesn't just fit into the category of people with lived experience, or people that might be working in the space with undisclosed lived experience, for example, or people that may have different experiences and don't relate to certain other types of experience. I think it's so important to understand that universally, and to feel empowered that we can collectively hold space for each other in the work that we're doing in a way that is quote unquote trauma informed. And I think that's one of the places that we wanted to start a little bit, because if we say that we are trauma informed, that by definition says that we need to be informed about trauma. And I think one of the things that really surprised me when I started doing some of this research is that there isn't actually a universal definition of the word trauma, but rather that many different disciplines, whether that's sociology, psychology, psychiatry, even medicine or other sort of disciplines, look at this issue of trauma almost like from different perspectives, but there was enough agreement between the fields and the way that they define trauma that I kind of pulled together a little definition that I found helpful, which said that basically, it's a physical or an emotional or a psychological response, like you said, to a distressing experience that can overwhelm that person's ability to cope or force them into sort of a physiological or a psychological crisis of survival. And I think that speaks to what you were sharing, where, trauma is something that necessitates that people have to respond in a way that is, really fighting for their survival. And the way that we've sometimes described the responses to that can sort of make people feel that there's something wrong with the way that they've responded to a situation that they've responded to by trying to survive. And I think that's something that's really helpful to think through. In what ways do we understand potentially how people are experiencing trauma, how we respond to it, and how we can actually heal from it? Because I think that's the other thing in being trauma informed. I've seen a lot of emphasis on the theory of preventing harm, but not so much the practice of creating opportunities to heal. And I think that's something that's really important to me personally.
I run off Judith Herman's definition of what is trauma. So that's an experience, that's an overwhelming experience where resistance or escape is not possible. That doesn't mean there isn't psychological resistance inside. I really want to say that because, dissociating or going absent mentally from the experience that you're having in that moment is an ingenious survival strategy that is a resistance strategy. But that resistance and escape are not going to be successful to stop the overwhelming experience. For me, which is pretty much what you said as well, Judith Herman is a feminist warrior in the psychiatry world around trauma and very depathologizing in this space. The other piece that I like in that is Bonnie Badenoch, who's a social worker and a sociologist, brings in the connection piece. So sometimes we can have overwhelming experiences, but if it's done in a connected space, so think about like surgery or delivering a baby or those sorts of things. If you have social safe connection around you, that won't necessarily be experienced as traumatic as if it's happening to you on your own. And so I think actually the connection piece is really important. And I know clinically for me, when I work with families, for example, where a child has a chronic illness and has to go through many medical procedures, we work really hard on that attachment so that the child is held within the social context, so within the familial context around connection, and that becomes the buffer to the ongoing impact of the traumatic experience. So those two are the things that I tend to think about. It's the only, and I'm sorry if I'm being a bit clinical, you can definitely rein me in on this, but I'm sorry, it's my 20 odd years of training. Interestingly, when we look at the DSM, which is the Diagnostic Statistical Manual that where it outlines all the different psychiatric diagnoses, it is actually sometimes referred to as the Book of Bad Names because it's overused in terms of pathologizing people. But when you look at the DSM, PTSD or trauma is the only diagnosis where the cause is not within the person per se in the way in which they describe it. It's like an event has occurred and therefore it's the adjustment to the event. Now, the adjustment to me is very, very normal and not disordered, right? The event is the disordered thing, if you like, in that space.
Absolutely. And I think that's some of the topics that we wanted to start to discuss is, I guess, for me, that is what gives us the opportunity to, I guess, change the narrative and to work within a framework, essentially, to respond to trauma differently. If we can understand it, if we see the trauma itself as the problem, not the person responding to it or trying to, those approaches that kind of try to manage a person rather than encouraging the healing that they might be needing to go through in responding to their own trauma. I think that's where we want this conversation to go. So as we're going through some of the topics that we wanted to touch on today are around understanding some of the types of trauma that might be relevant to modern slavery specifically, because that's obviously the cohort we're talking about. I wanted to talk a little bit more about what some of those trauma responses or the way that people might respond to trauma might actually look like in practice, because that's one of the big things that, we sometimes have fears around. I don't want to trigger someone. I don't want to re-traumatize someone. And I think demystifying some of that and really understanding, what does it look like when someone might be having a trauma response and how can I meaningfully respond to that? Because I think in terms of we can't necessarily control the triggers that someone might have or hold because of the experiences they've had, but there are definitely ways that we can work together to create an environment that is safe and creating support for people as they're navigating some of those things. So I think those were some of the things that we were wanting to talk through. And we also then will talk a little bit about what are some of the practical ways that we can respond to trauma in those situations, in a way that is supportive of that person's healing and integration into say a mainstream workplace, or if it's into other contexts such as a consultation or other work that people are wanting to do with people with lived experience, really trying to find some practical ways to ground our practice in that thinking about how we can do that safely and well. Finally, I also just wanted to highlight, I guess, in terms of any questions, feel free to pop them in the chat and we'll try and get to them as we go. But I guess I wanted to start a little bit with that term of complex trauma, Sophie. I wanted to highlight a few of the ones that we talk about, I guess, that we think of immediately with modern slavery. It's a type of experience that I guess brings so many different types of trauma together. But then I also wanted to give you a chance to sort of, you explained so beautifully to me in the past, the other types of trauma that people encounter in what we term an experience of complex trauma. And I think, like you said, it's usually a situation in which someone feels that they're trapped in a situation for a prolonged period of time, which I think sets it apart from those experiences that might be a one-off sort of situation of trauma. And I think that can really amplify the impact on that person, because instead of dealing with just one situation of trauma that they're trying to recover from, they're often subjected to that over a prolonged period of time repeatedly. We obviously think of things like physical trauma in terms of assaults or injuries that might be sustained during a time of exploitation. We think about emotional and psychological trauma that I think is universal to any type of trauma, really, unfortunately. We think about sexual and developmental trauma in instances in which, for example, there is sexual exploitation, or there is, child labor or child sexual exploitation that may disrupt someone's development. We think about social trauma and the way in which this particular type of abuse really weaponizes core relationships of trust. And often the perpetrators are someone that person has been relying on for help, or has a deep relationship of trust with, whether it's a family member or an external party that they've been relying on. That violation of trust can make it very difficult to sort of rebuild a sense of trust in the world. And obviously things like economical, financial trauma in people's lives can really destabilize that recovery process. We talk about spiritual and cultural trauma and racial trauma, in which people experience discrimination often across families and generations even. And just some of those broader types of trauma around abandonment and betrayal. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about that specifically, I guess, and how that all comes together in what we would term complex trauma.
Yeah, I think about, as you said, you've covered off most of it really, Sarah, as you usually do. You're so eloquent. Complex trauma, I sort of think about in a gross sort of big overriding kind of way. You've got like, a car crash might be like a single event adult trauma. And then complex trauma is more the repetitive nature. So sustained periods of time, repetitive, like multiple instances. Also, we would sort of put developmental trauma, so the traumas that happen throughout childhood, in the complex trauma space as well, because those traumas can shape people's ongoing, childhood is when we're making all those beautiful neural connections in our brain and we're learning how to cope with life and developing our personality. And so traumas in childhood, whilst they are recoverable from, it's really important that I put that out there, because no doubt we'll have people on this attending who are parents, and I'm a parent as well, and they are absolutely recoverable, but they can also form, this concept of complex trauma. I really also need to say, and we call it complex because it's multifaceted, as you said, and the things that you just described then also overlap each other. So if you're a person who is growing up in, basically in poverty or on the edge of poverty, and you've got parents who love you dearly but can't monitor you because they're working two jobs, then you're at risk of victimization, because you're the sort of the poor kid at school who maybe has to rely on other people for support and services and things like that. And so that relationship then can become the conduit of the way in which perpetration may occur. And so the term complex, the survivor is not complex. That's so important. The survivor
Absolutely.
is not complex. The survivor is an ingenious survivor. It's the nature of the trauma and the multifaceted nature of the trauma. In epidemiology, we call it like polyvictim. I really hate that term, but it's that thing that we see that traumas cluster together when they occur, if that makes sense. So we know in domestic violence there's a higher rate of childhood sexual abuse, and then there's a higher rate of child trafficking, and then there's a higher rate of parental crime, and those things tend to cluster together. And that's the bit that's complex, not the individual. And I think that that's really important, because I know that what we see clinically in our practice is that people are hearing complex trauma and therefore thinking they aren't able to heal. Because they're complex. They're not.
Absolutely. And I think that's what I was just you've just beautifully led into that conversation about, we have the opportunity in every interaction that we have with someone else and with each other to actually work towards that healing, because as much as those experiences of trauma may have impacted on our ability to trust or know how to safely engage with people or the environment around us, being trauma informed or being in a position where we address these issues means that we actually have the opportunity to heal some of those things. And the way that I talk about this to myself is to prove my own brain wrong, because in the past a lot of bad things have happened, and it's really hard for me to get away from that thought of, oh gosh, it's going to happen again. So what I have to do is I have to reinforce that I guess that understanding of, actually, I'm going to prove my brain wrong on this occasion, even though it's doing a good job warning me of danger, because in the past this has been a problem.
Thank you, brain.
Thank you for warning me, but also here are some opportunities to give some different inputs and some different proof to the brain that says, actually, I can respond differently to this, or potentially I don't want to. And I think it's important then to highlight a little bit of, I just talked a bit about the talking that I do to my brain. I don't talk to myself all the time, but I think that connection of understanding how our body and mind is responding to a situation because of potentially past trauma or even current trauma is a really good one, because I think in the past we've talked about fight or flight responses, and that's primarily based on physiological responses, and I think there are some really important things that we can learn from how our physical bodies respond. Usually those responses that we call the fight or flight responses are actually our autonomic nervous system switching into a survival mode that's going to optimize our body's chances of survival, which means that our heart rate's going faster, our breathing, our muscles are primed for action. So that's kind of the shaking that you'll get with the adrenaline coursing through people's bodies. It increases our body's capacity and energy source from oxygen and glucose and things like that to actually be able to move into action to survive. And so some of those things can be a part of our physiological trauma responses. But I also want to talk a little bit today about some of the psychosocial responses, because as you said, so much of the way that we engage with the world is through the lens of how we're connecting and engaging with other people. And that can be very much impacted by experiences of trauma. So, I always like to talk a little bit about what I call the other trauma responses. And like you said, a lot of them tend to develop more commonly in those prolonged, repetitive situations of trauma. So, for example, one that's more commonly talked about now is the fawning response, which is really, I don't quite know, I would, I guess, potentially say, and I'm being very conscious of the way that I explain this word, because, again, I'm very mindful of the way that people are shamed for having this kind of response, where basically someone has developed the response to basically they've learned that the best way to survive the situation they're in is to purposefully please or placate the source of threat or the abuser. And survivors often face judgment for their fawning responses because they're seen as almost participating or consenting to something happening, even though that's what they were just doing to try and get through the situation to survive. Something like a freeze response, for example, again, survivors are often shamed for not doing anything and kind of just being stuck, not kind of being frozen, and we also talk about things like the collapse and submit response, which is a very, very late, some people have called this in the past the response of last resort, where a person has essentially feels that they're in a situation of inescapable trauma, and the physical response is to kind of shut down and to almost turn into more of a submissive party in that space just to survive. And I think, again, these people we're often judged for not doing anything to escape or to get out of the situation, or take meaningful action to kind of confront the threat. But I think it's really important to see that that's actually a trauma response. The other one that I've heard,
survival strategy.
Yeah,
and a survival
absolutely.
strategy
To get through that. And our minds, like you said, are ingenious at trying to help us in those situations. And the last one that I do like to think about a little bit is the attach and cry for help response, which often is developed in those situations of developmental trauma where a primary caregiver or someone that person was absolutely relying on for survival, there's been some breach in the sort of way that's been responded to. And I think that's where, all of these ways of responding, as much as they help us to survive in the moment, I find that as a survivor coming out of those situations, one of the hardest things to unlearn almost is that some of the things that served us in trying to survive abuse do not serve us once we get out, because they actually disrupt the way that we would normally connect. So I was wondering if you wanted to share a little bit more from your experience about what that looks like for people trying to enter the real, I like to call it the real world, but I guess a space in which that might not be necessary anymore.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a couple of things. So first of all, I think a lot of 75% of women who are being sexually assaulted will actually freeze. So freeze is the most common response to those occasions. And I like to tell people that because I remember the first time I told a survivor that, she said, "Oh, like, is that why?" And she had shamed herself so badly for not fighting back. And we know that for many years, not fighting back was seen as a consent,
almost
passive consent.
Almost,
yeah, that's right. And so freeze is actually the survival strategy in there. And also I think that attach, the way I think about that attach or the fawn response is more that I think about like in a playground, that the bully's best friend is unlikely to be bullied compared to the person further away, or that the favourite child in a family system is less likely to get the abuse than the least favourite child. And we see it's replicated all throughout the primate world as well, that attach respond to the alpha, the dangerous alpha in a primate sort of system. I think also what you said, which makes so much sense, is that these were fantastic strategies designed for a very difficult situation. But when you get into the real world, as you say, or when you're sort of in a world where people are not offering threat, it's always safer to see threat and believe threat than not, right? Because nobody wants to be caught off guard. And that is everybody, that's all humans without experience of trauma, that we survived from the people who thought that the rustle in the leaves was a tiger, the people who thought it was just the wind actually probably got eaten, really. So in terms of evolution, we have evolved to be highly suspicious people. But also that what happens is that we can tend to start to see threat everywhere where it isn't, and then our survival strategies come in, and then we start responding to people who aren't offering threat as potential threatening. So I think that's sort of what you're saying is like, I learned this here. Super helpful.
It can really disconnect us at so many of the things that I've experienced myself, but also hear from other survivors, is that trying to figure out how to reconnect safely with others is so challenging after that. And so I think that leads us perfectly into that sort of that piece that we wanted to talk a bit about more practically. So okay, we've got, people that are coming, ourselves included, we're all coming to the space carrying potential traumas and I guess neurological pathways that are telling us this is, a threat, this is a threat, or this is, something I should be worried about.
Yeah.
So in responding then, my goal is always, because one of the things that we do know about, when our bodies do go into a trauma response, whether that has some of the physical symptoms I described or whether it's just a psychosocial response, we do know that when the brain switches into that kind of survival mode, unfortunately, it deprioritizes some of those other things like critical thinking and problem solving abilities and, the ability to regulate your body in what we call a resting state, to be sort of calm and rested, to actually be able to do what you're trying to do. So my goal is always, how do I get people out of a trauma response? We might not be able to control the triggers that might lead to someone having a response that activates them. We're using more of the terminology of being activated these days rather than saying that someone's triggered, just because it's an easier way to understand that all of those responses might be activated simultaneously or individually. And so really
it's not valenced as well. Like triggered seems bad, but activated is like alive, like
it's
without
kind of
a
your body is
qualitative
responding.
judgment across it. I like it too.
So I think how we can respond when we're activated, and how we can hold space with someone that is activated. For me, the goal is always to get someone out of that trauma response. And I've developed a little thing that helps me. And I think you reminded me brilliantly of I like to think about regulating or re-regulating, de-escalating a situation, and also I guess validating that person's experience and where they're at the moment. And I look at that kind of as a circular thing, very much, starting with our own selves. When someone is activated in front of me and they might be getting quite emotional or quite angry and defensive, or they might even abruptly leave the situation, in responding to that, I'm always very aware that my own sense of self might be quite activated and I might be responding, my own trauma might be responding. So it's about, finding those ways to regulate. And the goal of regulating, I guess, is to be grounded and to sort of, I guess, allow those trauma responses to sort of calm down for ourselves. I know that that's probably not the right words, given that calming down, telling people to calm down is never helpful.
Never worked in the history of humankind.
Yeah, that's right. But I think also just a point, I think, all three of those things, validating, de-escalating, and re-regulating, are things that might be useful in flux. Like there'll be a point at which maybe one of them will have more emphasis than the other. But I think it's really important to hear that person wherever they're at, whatever they're expressing, whether they're expressing anger or fear, validating what that person is experiencing in that moment is so important. Did you want to talk a little bit about the de-escalation and re-regulation side of things? Because I think those can be quite tricky when we're looking at, we don't want to shut someone down, but we also want to help someone de-escalate some of that activation.
I think, absolutely. The first thing I always do and I always teach is like you have to regulate yourself first. So I'm really conscious about what message my nervous system is sending somebody else. So if I'm coming in and I'm frazzled and I'm hurried, I'm going to put somebody else on edge. Our activation, whether it's a trauma response or not, our nervous systems relate to each other, right? When you're around a stressed person, you feel more stressed than when you're around a calm person. So that regulate yourself first also allows you to get connection to your complex thinking processes and your higher order thinking processes. And we can't tell someone they're safe. Like I can't say, Sarah, you're safe. I have to give you an experience of safety. And I give you an experience of safety by calming my face. So I don't frown at you. I like settle my face, and our faces communicate either safe to come forward or you better stay back. And so I think about what do you see when you look at me in terms of safety or not safety? That's the first thing I sort of think about. And then the de-escalation is, it's not words. Instructions don't de-escalate a situation. So we often, and I saw this the other day with some security guards where this man was really frustrated. He was really scared about some financial situations, and they were like, mate, you're going to have to calm down or you're going to have to leave. And it's like, that's
not helpful.
Does not work. So de-escalation is actually saying, well, this is really stressful for you. This is really stressful for you.
Validation as well, isn't it?
Yeah, and the empathy piece. Yeah.
And I think sometimes if
and
you can reiterate, like I remember doing training as a nurse to do de-escalate sort of,
yes,
so-called aggressive people in an emergency department, for example. And sometimes just
Yeah.
hearing and validating where that person might be coming from and the stress that they
Mhm.
might be experiencing is enough to kind of get that calming, that sort of that calming effect that you want. But yeah, it's so important.
I think also that don't forget that aggression is the flip side of fear. So it's fight or flight. So when people are being aggressive, it's because they're usually frightened. And if we can hold that and say, well, you're really stressed here, this is really hard for you, that actually does tend to calm down that aggression response as well. And so there's a lovely term in psychology which we say be contagious with calm, which is, if you can remain calm, you're almost like pulling them towards you with the calmness as well.
And I think it's really interesting. I am aware that we are coming to our question time. So if people want to pop some questions in the chat, please feel free as we just wrap this up. I think one of the things that I think of a lot is that there's a real sense of needing to, like, I think when we're engaging with people with lived experience, I've seen a lot of behaviors that, like you say, aim to manage people's behaviors, and I don't know that that's the right way to create the safety that we're looking for. And I think rather it's about creating an environment of safety, but also like, and I see this unfortunately in healthcare quite a lot, is that, that person, instead of seeing the struggle or the stress that they're going through, we quite often see them as the difficult person, the person
100%.
that's being difficult in that situation. And I think the more that we can tap into where is this coming from for this person, the more that we're able to understand that journey and give them the connection that they might need to actually be able to walk through that and re-regulate. And re-regulation, if we're going to define it, is just really allowing our stress responses to go back to a normal resting baseline. And for some of us, that happens very rarely. And the issues with prolonged situations of trauma is that when we talk about sort of trauma, like the impact of trauma or trauma conditions, I like to call them, rather than sort of disorders, the remaining sort of impact is often that it is hard for us to get back into sort of a normal resting heart rate, normal sleep patterns, all of those things. So in terms of re-regulation, there's lots of things that survivors share with me and that I do. Sometimes it's as simple as going and putting some headphones in and listening to some music so that your nervous system can kind of calm down, or just get back to that resting state, or getting back to a place of feeling safe and in control of what's happening. Is all about that re-regulation. And I think I wish we had so much more time to talk about what it looks like to create safety for people. But I think if we start there, if we start to try and be curious about where is someone coming from and what can I do to bring safety to this situation and to them, and to make them feel heard, and the distress that we then see and the fear, like you said, and the anger and some of those other things that come up, quite often will de-escalate literally not on their own, I guess, but they start to de-escalate as they are heard. So yeah, I think we have so much more to share, but it would be great to start to take some of the questions, and we might be able to cover some of that off as well. Corinne, did you want to share some of the questions?
Thank you, Sophie. Thank you, Sarah. I'll jump back in and go through some of these questions we've been getting. That was incredibly interesting conversation. I think maybe to start with you just to lead off on the last thing you were talking about, Sarah, is around some of those I guess practical ways of creating safety for people, and if you wanted to sort of explain a little bit more about that and give some ideas to the people watching as well.
I think like the way that we create environment is very, very powerful. So things that it might seem really simple, but for example, someone's nervous system that is on high alert finds lots of noise and stimulus in terms of lights, sounds, other things, crowding, people around them,
Smells.
very overwhelming because your whole system is on high alert to assess for risk, and that becomes like heightened, I guess, in those situations. So when I think about an environment, I think about things that make it feel safer are, volume regulation, things that aren't echoey, or, lots of bright, harsh lighting can be very overwhelming. So creating an environment that kind of tones down some of the sensory input can be very helpful. Thinking about the space, it may be as simple as them being able to see the exit. I always have to sit somewhere where I can see the exit, because otherwise I get incredibly anxious. So the environment and the way that we create that, having some plants, being able to step outside for a breath of fresh air, those things are all really, really powerful in creating a sense of calmness around that person. And then, even in terms of the things that we can do safely to interact safely, is to be very conscious of the each action and interaction and the way that that can feel to that other person. And it's very difficult, like Sophie, you said, when we're in a rush or we're trying to get through what we're trying to get through, it can be very difficult to take the time to listen at those moments and pay attention.
I would also just add to that, I think transparency is key. So I think that if you've got rules in your workplace, if there's particular tasks, what I find is that survivors like to have more knowledge than less, and opportunities to ask all those questions. It might not be in that rush moment that all those questions can be asked. But for example, when we run our survivor workshops, we get lots of questions like, where can I park? Can I put my lunch in your fridge? What's the air conditioning like? What can I expect if I walk in the door? So we would do things when we changed our furniture in our reception area. We took photos and emailed it to our clinicians, and we asked the clinicians to email it to all our clients, so that nobody walked in and got a shock. So there's that extra information, which
that predictability and
100%
a known entity.
Exactly. And it's not that change isn't manageable. It's just that it needs more words and it needs to be more information go with it.
I think a lot of experience of trauma are really about removing somebody's agency and sense of autonomy, and the sense of not being in control of your life and what's happening to you. And so any way that we can give that back to survivors is really powerful. If we can, when we talk about informed consent, it's not just because it's a legal requirement, it's because knowing exactly what someone's getting into and having the choice to do things that are right for you as a survivor speaks so much more to the feeling of being safe in that situation. So I think that that's a really important point to raise as well with the transparency, is how much information we can give people to help them feel that they can truly engage in a way that is on their terms.
Yeah.
Great. We've got some really interesting questions just come in. I'll maybe do two at once, and you can sort of see who would like to answer which one. But one person is asking around if you're able to touch on the concepts of co-regulation and post-traumatic growth, if you can, and also whether a little bit about if you can comment on any of the longer-term cognitive effects of trauma, and could this look like neurodivergence for some people potentially?
I will let you maybe speak to some of the co-regulation and post-traumatic growth, but starting with that question of neurodivergence, this is a really interesting question, because myself and several of my survivor friends have now also been sort of, grappling with the knowledge that we probably are neurodiverse. And I think it is very difficult because a lot of the complex trauma symptoms overlap with what people who are neurodiverse experience. So I've said to my psychiatrist at one point, I said, I don't know where the trauma starts and the neurodivergence stops. Like, they're very interlinked. And, it would be great to see some work on that specifically, whether also being neurodiverse potentially, some of the things that might create safety for other people, for example, being able to read social cues very easily versus not being able to read them as easily potentially, or having a different sense of viewing and interpreting the world may actually put people at greater risk of experiencing certain types of particularly relational trauma. And I think that's something that is very, very complex to pull apart. And I think it can often make people feel like, oh, maybe there's something wrong with me that this happened to me. And I think that's something that I very strongly resist, I guess, in terms of, I think it is important to understand how neurodiversity fits into all of that, but also how potentially it might impact on the healing of trauma if we are potentially misdiagnosing or potentially, not recognizing that there are other things at play. In terms of post-traumatic growth, I love that concept. Sophie, did you want to speak to that a little bit more? Because I think, like you've highlighted, trauma is not a life sentence in the way that people sometimes think of it, I think.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think if I could talk just a second about the co-regulation. So, we humans aren't born being able to regulate themselves. We learn regulation via the caregiving and the quality of caregiving that we're given. And if you think about it, like an anxious parent can't settle an anxious baby. So co-regulation is where the more regulated nervous system if you've got two people, tries to entice the less regulated nervous system to be regulated with them rather than become dysregulated as well. So that's where I was talking about, like, being contagious with calm. If you're the person who is more regulated, that's where you want to try and encourage the other person to be regulated with you. Humans and animals, we co-regulate with, I actually can't imagine a world without having a dog. I've had a dog all of my life. I have an amazing golden retriever, and nobody can give you eyes like a golden retriever, but he is part of the co-regulation strategy of my home, right? Because he's a mammal and he's got a nervous system that's not dissimilar to ours. In terms of traumatic post-traumatic growth, I have a lot of thoughts around that. Let me give you the very small nutshell, which is not possible. The top line is the people who I know who are, say, prosecutors of people who harm children and who work in the child protection space and those sorts of things tend to be survivors, and they are doing this amazing work. They would say, and they've said to me, I'm able to do this because of where I've been, and this is my post-traumatic growth, is to be able to kind of not only do something about it, but to stomach the horrible things that happen in our society and remain regulated enough or remain connected to their conscious thinking well enough such they can get in there and do something about it. And so I actually, not that we would ever want anybody to go through trauma as a way to get to that growth side, but what we actually see is really wonderful examples, many. I think Rosie Batty was a great example of post-traumatic growth and the work that she's done as well, and also a great example of somebody who needed to step out and not do so much as well, like people care for herself.
And I think that's when we talk about this idea of lived experience engagement. That's what we want to create opportunity for. We want it to be. And first of all, I always say it should be something that's right for the person, like I said, to step in and out of, whether that's something that's meaningful and important to them. But then that idea that if they are going to do that, which is, a very big thing to do, to use things that have been very impactful and painful potentially in your life to actually, drive you to do, whether it's advocacy work or other engagement in the sector or other sectors, that's what the goal would be, to create that in an empowering way so that people can actually find the meaning and the healing out of that work that we want to see. Corinne, I know we're rapidly running out of time.
Approaching. I will ask just one more final thing, which wraps up a little bit of a few questions that have come in along the same lines, and also Sarah, maybe to give a little bit of a preview of what's coming down the line around this work. This is the first conversation we've had, and so a few people have been asking around trauma-informed, integrating a trauma-informed approach into their work, whether they're a business looking to report under the Modern Slavery Act or service provider looking to do that within their services. And so it might be an opportunity as well, Sarah, if you wanted to signpost a little bit about what's coming down the line in that side.
Yeah, I think, look, the biggest thing, the reason that I wanted to start with this opening conversation is that, like we said, if we want to be trauma informed, we need to understand trauma. We need to understand how it manifests. We need to understand how to respond to it. We need to know how it heals. But oftentimes people are like, just tell me what I need to do. We want to be trauma informed, but sometimes we don't necessarily know the practical steps to do that. And I think using lots and lots of resources that are out there these days in terms of research. One of the things that we're working on for the Office of the Anti-Slavery Commissioner, and we're working closely with both people with lived experience, but also people on the advisory panel like Sophie, that to develop I guess a practice guide that will start to put some of these things together in a very practical way, giving little practice exercises or examples of how things might be implemented in a trauma-informed way. And one of the things that you'll notice in our little mini series, as we're calling it, from the Desk of Lived Experience, is that while we're talking about some of these introductory topics around trauma, we're going to move in the next couple of months into that sort of more practical application. Like, what does it look like in practice, and what can I do if I'm talking to a survivor in a consultation, or what do I do before the consultation, that kind of thing. Because to me, one of the things that I'm learning more and more is that this is a process. It's not we can't just sort of do the engagement. We need to think about what happens before to prepare people, and what happens during that engagement, and what happens afterwards to look after the people that have engaged. So you'll be seeing a lot more of that stuff. I don't even know, that's not the right word. Those sorts of things coming through our work, both from the Desk of Lived Experience, but also in some of the materials that we'll be releasing for some of the frameworks and tools that we're developing. So I hope that answers your question a little bit. Corinne, I know you just popped up this survey
I
to
will
us.
just, I'll very
let you
quickly
close.
if people do have a few minutes just to complete the survey to give us some feedback about this webinar. I've put the link in the Q&A there as well if you want to have a look at that. And just very quickly as well, just before Sarah wraps up, just a reminder of the details there around the phone counselling service that is available this evening between 5 and 6. The details are also in the Q&A. But I'll hand back to you, Sarah, now to wrap us up.
Well, I wanted to say, just as we're closing, a very big thank you to all of you who've taken the time to join us today, and Sophie for joining. I very much wish that we'd had a lot more time to delve into more detail. I'm really hoping that we can just see this as a starting conversation, just starting to put some of these things on our radar and starting to explore these ideas and the knowledge that we need to I guess, work in a way that centers healing and that does work towards well-being for us as a collective team, whether you're identify as a survivor or someone with lived experience or not. But Sophie, did you have some closing words?
Oh no, just such a pleasure to be together and to talk through such important things. I can't believe how quickly an hour goes, Sarah, when you and I talk. And I think we talk on super speed as well, but really grateful just to everyone showing up, like how important this is. My life's work, this is your life's work, but how it's so great to have other people in this space with us. It bolsters us when we start to feel tired. So I'm thrilled. Thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone. And yes, hope to continue these conversations in the future. It's not the end, just the beginning.
Yeah, thank you.